welcome to Preparing Your Data from the Affirmative Action Plan, Hiring. My name is Carla Irwin. I'm the president of Carla Irwin and Associates, and Stephanie and I would like to welcome you to this series of getting back to basics regarding your Affirmative Action Plan data. And we're kicking it off with hiring data. I am the president of Carla Irwin and Associates, and the firm specializes in affirmative action consulting from soup to nuts. So it does your affirmative action plans. It helps you with implementation, training, audit, anything that you need as a federal contractor to fulfill your affirmative action regulations. So I would like to welcome you and also introduce Stephanie Thomas.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Thomas, and I'm the founder of Thomas Econometrics. We are a full-service quantitative consulting firm, and we specialize in quantitative solutions to workplace issues. We look at adverse impact in all of your selection and compensation decisions. We do wage and hour analysis. We do proactive risk management solutions all the way through litigation support and expert testimony. So if it's related to a workplace process, we can analyze it quantitatively. And I'd just like to say again, thanks to everybody for joining us. And just one caveat before we get started. I'm an economic and statistical consultant. Carla's specializing in AAPs. Neither one of us want you to construe any of the information we're going to talk about today as legal advice. It's not legal advice. So just keep that in mind as we go forward.
Great. Started. Okay. A little bit about the webinar series, and we're kind of calling this Getting Back to Basics. And one of the reasons for that is the OFCCP is putting out a lot of new proposed regulations. They're trying to make a lot of changes to the way you do AAPs, the way that they're doing audits. And we kind of wanted to take a step back and talk to people about what the base of an AAP is, and that's the data. And so that's the point of this Getting Back to Basics webinar series, is just really taking apart what is the data that you need to create the AAP. All of the analysis later will be something, is something different, but, helping you understand the data and how to clean it up, kind of the basics of your AAP.
And this is the first of 6 scheduled webinars. Today we're going to talk about hiring. On the 28th of this month, we'll be talking about promotion data, the kinds of data that you need, how to clean it, how to look for gaps in your data. Then on the 12th of October, we're going to move to termination and cover the same issues. On October 26th, we'll be talking specifically about workforce snapshot data and how to process and clean that data to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. On November 9th, we'll be talking about applicant flow. I know that's a really big, hot topic right now, so that one should be interesting. And then we'll close out the first of the 6 on November 30th with a compensation data webinar. So as Carla mentioned, the first 6 in this series are really designed to help you understand what kinds of data you need, how to prepare that data, how to clean that data, how to look for holes, how to fill it in to make it as accurate as possible. And then beginning in 2012, we're going to take the webinar series to the second part, where we'll move on to the new scheduling letter requirements and how each of these data elements, hiring data, promotion, termination, etc., how those fit into the new scheduling letter and what you need to know about the new scheduling letter vis-a-vis these data points. All right, so basically what we're going to cover today, just to give you a little overview of where we're headed, we're going to talk about the data requirements, the data that you need for your AAP in terms of hiring, and we're going to limit it specifically to the hiring data. We'll talk about the common types of missing hiring data and what the effect is of that missing data on your AAP. And then we're going to conclude with a discussion of data scrubbing and some common validation tools. We're not going to get into too much detail in terms of the nuts and bolts of actually, doing pivot tables in Excel or writing statistical programs. We just want to give you an overview of the kinds of issues and the kinds of things that you need to look at and think about when you're doing data scrubbing and validation.
Okay, now we're going to get into talking about what is the required data that you need for your AAP. And the first thing I want to start off talking about is really you need employee level data. And what I mean by that is instead of preparing summary reports of, how many of this race and gender by this job title or by this job group, the best way to prepare an AAP and have the most data is to get it at the employee level. So, there's a line for each employee that this types of information. So let's talk about what are some of the fields that need to be populated in the hiring report. So I'm going to first talk about unique identifiers and what I mean by that. And it's a broad term and for a couple different reasons. I mean employee identification number, employee name, something that can identify that employee. I do not suggest using Social Security number, and I know some systems some companies that don't have employee numbers will sometimes use Social Security numbers as unique identifiers in reports. I highly suggest not using this for a couple different reasons. One, obviously that's a sensitive, confidential piece of information that you're then putting into a spreadsheet and either sharing with other people on the team to do the AAP or sharing it with a consultant that you may be using. And so, just be aware that that's not a good unique identifier. Either do it by employee name or employee number. Employee number is the best because the larger the company, the more chance you have of people having the same name. And when you're cross-referencing different logs and doing comparisons, it's best to have a completely unique identifier, employee number being the best. Okay. So what else do you need to have on the report? So we talked about employee number, we've talked about employee name. The obvious thing, demographics. You need to have race and gender for each of the people that were hired within the plan year. Job title and job code. So different companies call it different things. Job title, job code, position title, position code is important to have. You need to know what the job is, and not just what their job is when you pull the report, but what their job was when they were hired. That's very important because your codes are tied to your job titles, and you really want to be analyzing it based on the title that they had at the time of hire. Your EEO1 and AAP groups, so you could call them AAP groups, AA job groups. Different companies call them different things, but essentially you want your EEO1 report and then your more specific AA group that you use for your affirmative action plan. Now, if you're under 150 employees, you probably don't use an AAP group, you just use your EEO1 group. If you're over 150, you need to be using a more specific AAP group. Next is location. This is very important for employers with multiple locations. If you're going to do just a mass download, it's in, your AAPs are done by location, so it's very important for you and or the consultant that you're working with to know what location these people are connected with in order to do the correct analysis. And then hire, rehire, and termination dates. So you kind of think, oh, hire, rehire, and then why do we need termination dates? Okay, so hire date typically that people pull out is this is their original hire date. And so that should be on there. Rehire date, there are some industries that recall or rehire on a regular basis, or there are certain types of jobs that people get rehired on a regular basis. And so it's really important to know, while they may have an original hire date of 2007, they get rehired every other year or every year. And so that's important to know that they are rehires. It's important to know that they're rehires for a few reasons, which we'll talk about later, but it's an important field to have. And I know that sometimes this is difficult from a systems perspective, but if you can get it, it's very helpful. And termination dates. If the person that's on the hire log was hired and termed within the plan dates that we're talking about, that's important to know because it's another validation point as you're comparing people that are in our hire log and on the term log, making sure you have everybody that you should have on your log. So a couple things that I want to point out about this is whether you're doing it manually or whether you're pulling it from a system. So if you're an employer that is doing this manually, these are really the minimum fields that you would want to put in there. The reason I differentiate between manual and the system is for those people that are doing it manually, to have excessive fields that they may use in the future can be a little bit onerous on them and take a lot of time. So I'm really giving you the basics of what you would need, whether you're doing it manually or pulling it through an HRS system. If you're pulling it from an HRIS system, you know, you can include a lot more information, including their FLSA status, their full-time, part-time, things that may help you make decisions or give you more information on them if it's something as easy as, you know, putting it into a report. And then finally, what I want to point out about this and why we're focusing on this hiring report and how it gets compared. And so the hiring report is part of the adverse impact analysis that you do annually with regard to your affirmative action plan. So this hiring data gets compared with your applicant flow and gets analyzed multiple different ways. There's different statistics that you can use, 80%, standard deviation, Fisher's exact. I'm sure Stephanie as a statistician has, you know, many different ways that it can be analyzed. But really we're looking for evidence of discrimination. And so again, kind of the reason why we want to get back to basics and really understand the data is your best defense against issues that you have an adverse impact, and specifically today we're talking about hiring, is having good data. And good data is always a good business justification.
All right, so in addition to the required data that Carla just talked about, I'd like to add some non-AAP required, it's not required data, but it's suggested data. And again, this is going to depend on whether you're constructing this manually from records or whether you're using an HRIS system. Some suggested data that you may want to include is expanded demographic information on other protected characteristics. For the AAP proper, you need to report it by gender, race, and ethnicity. But from a risk management or an audit or a litigation perspective, there's a lot of other characteristics about your employees that you want to capture. Probably first and foremost is age. And ideally what you want to do here is capture the date of birth rather than age, because age, unlike gender or race, age changes over time. So if you have the date of birth, it's very easy to calculate what the person's age is as of a specific date. It's also a good idea to capture the disability status and the veteran status. As we're going to talk about, and Carla's going to talk about this a little more, that information actually is required for other parts of your AAP. Disability status and veteran status is not a required reporting dimension for the hiring analysis, but it is important for other aspects of the AAP. It's also a good idea to capture marital status, sexual orientation if you can get it, any other kind of demographic information about protected characteristics that you can access. Again, it's not required for the AAP, but you may need it in the event of an audit or if you're involved in discrimination litigation. I'd just like to point out that the collection on this demographic information really depends on the particular laws of the locality and the state that you're located in. Some states and localities recognize sexual orientation, for instance, as a protected characteristic, whereas other localities and other states don't. So talk to your employment attorney, find out what protected characteristics specifically relate to your locality, your city, your state, and collect the information accordingly. It's recommended that you collect this information in the hiring process. It's the easiest place to do it. It's easier to collect it on an ongoing basis than it is to try to go back and recreate and fill in age and marital status and disability status for a whole host of employees. If you collect it on an ongoing basis, it's not only going to reduce your cost, it's going to reduce your effort, and you're going to have that information in the event that you need it. And I always say it's better to have the data and not need it than to need the data and not have it. When we don't have the data and we ultimately need it in the event of an audit or litigation, If you don't have that information collected, then you're looking at very time-consuming, very expensive data entry projects. Can really increase the whole cost, both in terms of effort and money, of the litigation defense. So for these expanded demographic characteristics, the ideal is to use voluntary identification forms, just like you do for the voluntary disclosure of gender or race, things like that. We certainly don't want to do visual identification on age. We don't want to do visual identification on marital status or sexual orientation or any of these other things. And in some cases, like disability status, it's really almost not possible to do a visual identification. Most of the people who have disabilities, you wouldn't know that they're disabled by looking at them. So, if somebody has a seeing eye dog or is in a wheelchair, we may be able to make an inference about their disability status. But for most people, there's going to be no visual evidence of the fact that they have a disability. So use the voluntary identification forms. Don't do visual identification. And like I said, it's easier to collect this as an ongoing project, with every hire in your hiring process. Build it in. That way you have it in the event that you need it.
Okay. We have a little asterisk next to the disability and veteran status for the point of those things are part of your AAP. They are currently not part of the hiring data that needs to be collected, other than that is collected in the new hire paperwork. So you don't collect it at the application point, you collect it at the point where you've made the offer, they're filling out your new hire paperwork. But this is also just a good opportunity for me to mention that the Best 100 report is going to be due. You can't start submitting that until after October 1st due to technical issues, but you do have your Best 100 and 100A reports. And also, the OFCCP has put out proposed regulations with regard to veterans. We expect to see proposed regulations with regards to individuals with disabilities, that we're going to start to see a statistical plan the same way that we do with females and minorities. So this is going to, you have to collect it now. In the future, you will probably be collecting it earlier in the process and using it in your hiring data also.
Okay, so we've talked about the required and suggested data. Let's now talk about the required documentation. And ideally, you want to maintain any documentation about information used in your hiring decision. And we have here electronically maintained. Ideally, it's easier to keep things electronically than it is to keep boxes and boxes and boxes of paper. With new technologies and online storage, storing things electronically saves you a lot of financial cost. It also saves you storage space, so you can save on rent and overhead and great things like that. Storing things electronically essentially gives you a common repository of this data. And one of the problems that I see, not really that often, but often enough to make it a concern, is that different locations store their information in different ways. Some have, they use the HRIS system to integrate it. Others keep it in a separate Excel spreadsheet or some kind of a document. Others keep it, in paper form in boxes. So if you have an electronically maintained system to maintain this information, you can get a common repository, and you'll have continuity in the kinds of information that's collected. So you don't have to worry that location A keeps information on marital status, but location B doesn't. If it's integrated into your HRIS system, you'll have continuity of the kinds of information that are collected. Electronic data is also easier to work with. It's easier to work with for you, and it's easier for us as consultants to work with. Again, it's going to save you time and effort in terms of data entry in the event that you need to go back and look at those pieces of information that were used in the hiring decision. And it's really going to reduce the time and the cost. So what kinds of information should you maintain electronically? Ideally, you want to have anything that you use to make a hiring decision. And examples would be things like resumes or CVs, applications. Next.
Sorry.
That's okay. bear with me one second. You want to keep resumes and CVs electronically. You want to keep an electronic copy of the application. With a lot of the online application systems now, those kinds of tools, all that information is already electronic. So the application is really an easy part. You want to keep the notes from interviews you make, whether that be a telephone interview or an in-person interview. You want to keep your self-ID forms. That's the voluntary disclosure of gender, race, ethnicity. Ideally, those things should be maintained electronically. It makes them a lot easier to work with. So anything that you use in your selection process, pre-employment screening results, if you have prior employment history or work experience information that's not included on the application or the resume, if you garner that information from interviews, you want to keep a record of that. And anything in the hiring process that you use to make a decision should be documented. And ideally, you want to keep an electronic copy of it. That way, in the event of an audit or litigation, you've got all this information ready. You don't have to waste time and money going through a big data entry project to try to recreate everything that you did, to dig through these boxes of paper to try to find the information for the candidates that you considered. So electronic maintenance is definitely the way to go.
Okay. A couple things from a documentation perspective that I want to talk about for the OFCCP. First is electronic is great. It's the best way to go. One thing to understand is you need to be able to print it out. So all of this information that Stephanie just went through is all required information that you need to keep under your affirmative action regulations for 2 years that need to be maintained. Electronic is best and easiest for you for many different ways, but you need to be able to have it print out in a readable fashion for the OFCCP in the event of an audit that they ask you for it. One of the things a couple things that I want to point out, one of the items, interview notes, are one of those tricky. A lot of this other stuff, either your ATS or your HRIS is keeping that for you. Interview notes is one of those tricky things. If you're a recruiter and you have an ATS that has the ability to put your notes in, writing those notes in, keep them of record, right in your system is great. If you have the ability to take emails from your hiring managers where you get feedback and put those into your ATS, that kind of thing. But interview notes is one of those things where when I come in to help a client with an audit, a lot of that's missing, and we have to dig for it manually. It's not kept electronically. So just an FYI on that.
And one more point before we move on to the missing data point issue. When we're talking about electronically maintained information, Carla and I really mean more than just PDF files. You need to be able to print that information to deliver it, but it's easier to keep that in some sort of an editable form, so to speak, when you're working with consultants. If Carla or I receive data in a PDF file, again, you're looking at a very expensive and time-consuming data entry project. So it's fine to be able to print it out in PDF, but you want to keep that data in some form that can be manipulated, either in a database or a spreadsheet or some other way that you can work with the data without having to extract it from a PDF or an image file.
Okay, we're going to move on to some common missing data points. And the first one is race, gender, ethnicity, any of your other demographic information. This is, I will get an Excel file typically of the hire log, and that information is missing. And it can be missing for a couple different reasons. One is that the race and gender ethnicity is asked through the applicant tracking system, or it's a manual paper form that's been put in, and it hasn't been put into the HRIS system yet, either from the applicant tracking system or from the manual piece of paper. So the hire log will be missing race, gender, and ethnicity. It seems to be more often. So I'm going to go through how to collect it and voluntary versus employer identification. So how do you go about collecting your race, gender, and ethnicity? First is do it during the application process. And for those of you who have applicant tracking systems, where people apply electronically on your website. Putting it there up front as soon as they're submitting their resume and or their application, and they do it electronically right on your site would be my suggestion. If you have a system that doesn't allow for that and you have to later push it out, I think you have a couple options. Would be to email them a form, email it to them, mail it to them, but somehow get them a self-ID form either electronically or paper, and it really depends on your process, whether it's electronic or whether it's manual. And if you have a manual process and you're kind of a medium to large size company, this is going to be very difficult for you in terms of tracking. Okay, I sent this paper self-ID form out. How do I connect it back to my log? So I would probably start thinking about how to do it electronically, and if there's a reasonably priced applicant tracking system that would help me with the process. However, if through your electronic process or your manual process, the applicant has declined to provide you this information, then put it in as part of their new hire paperwork, that you have it when they become an employee. Now, if after all these attempts that you've made through electronic and manual systems, they still haven't provided that to you, then as a last resort, once they are an employee, kind of on your premises, then you do visual identification. This is the option of last resort. Never make assumptions based on their name. Actually have someone do a visual identification. Always self-ID is better and it's your first choice over visual identification, but after every step that we've kind of talked about and they still don't do it, you are ultimately going to need to have that information not just for your AAP, but for your EEO-1 report. Okay, so the next types of common data points for job title. One of them is job title at time of hire. I kind of talked about this when we were talking about what are the fields that need to be collected, and that this is where I see an issue even with people who have an HRIS system versus they're putting all this stuff together manually. Really pay attention either to your HRIS system that the report is set to pull the title at the time of hire and not just what that person's current title is. But some systems don't even allow that because they don't keep the history. As soon as you write something over that, they get a promotion, they get a pay increase, they get a job title change. The system doesn't hold on to that historical information. So in that case, you really need to pull the report as as close to the times as possible, or make note somehow of the promotion changes. So that's a really important.
And with respect to hire date, there's kind of 2 points that I want to make here. With the hire dates, sometimes we see that the hire dates are actually overwritten by what I call a system conversion date or a database load date. This kind of thing happens when somebody switches from a manual system to an electronic HRIS system, or they switch HRIS system providers, and you're essentially starting a new system. Oftentimes, let's say that you switch to a new system on July 1st. When you load those records into the new HRIS system, the hire date is going to be overwritten with a date of July 1st because that's the earliest day that we see a record for that individual. It doesn't usually pose a significant issue for a single plan year, but it is important to maintain historic information. With respect to auditing and the litigation environment, incorrect hire dates can really create a lot of havoc, particularly in promotion and compensation. Not so much in the hiring analysis, but you'll need those correct dates when you go to look at other kinds of selection decisions and compensation decisions that you make. So it's really important to keep an eye out for that. It's always best to preserve as much historic information as you can. The other thing is, as Carla mentioned, the hire versus rehire date. And depending on the industry and the job, the hire versus rehire date will be of differing levels of importance. If you're the kind of organization that doesn't have a whole lot of rehire activity, it's probably not going to be a major issue. If you're involved in an industry or you have a particular job that's frequently laid off and then recalled or terminated and rehired, the hire versus the rehire date becomes more important. So you really need to look at your own organization, where you fall in the industry category, whether or not you have a lot of hire-rehire activity to figure out if this is really important. But it is a potential issue, and we really do like to make a distinction between the original hire date and the most recent hire date.
And just kind of one point before we kind of move on is you're really getting two different points of view in terms of, from my perspective, really managing OFCCP audits. Stephanie doing not just supporting OFCCP audits but litigation, and so you're really hearing what are the issues that we've seen as we're trying to help clients through audits, and that was kind of the point of this. Is we see clients that are making common mistakes or there are gaps that we wanted to be able to help people say, okay, let's kind of get past these common mistakes to move on to the bigger picture. These are two big ones. We have a hard time helping you through an audit and giving you business justifications for things when the data behind it is inaccurate. So if we don't have the correct title, hire date, race and gender, all of those are key integral components to your AAP, but more importantly, to support you in the event that there's an issue with regard to adverse impact in your hiring in an audit or in litigation.
So let's talk about the effect of missing data. And we're just going to put it out here in plain and simple terms. Bad data generates a bad AAP. If you have bad data, and by bad data we mean inaccurate data, data that are full of gaps, things that are missing, if you have bad data, it's going to lead to inaccurate conclusions about your selection processes. And so today we're talking about hiring, but it's equally applicable to your promotions, your workforce snapshots, compensation decisions, applicant flow information. If you don't have good data, then there's no way that you can have a good AAP and get reliable, accurate conclusions. The statistics, whether we're talking about the utilization analysis or we're talking about the adverse impact analysis for the AAP, whatever kind of statistics, the statistics are only as good as the data that generate them. And if you have missing data, you may have inaccurate conclusions drawn from your analyses. And there's two things that can happen here. It makes it difficult to identify where your real problem areas and your real issues are. Missing data can make you think that you have an issue, for instance, discrimination against women, that doesn't really exist. It can also mask an issue that really does need to be addressed. So it's both sides of the coin here. You can mask real problems that are going on, or you can have the case where it looks like you have an issue because of this bad data, but when you clean up your data, you find out that everything is really okay. So it's really, really important to have accurate, comprehensive, complete data in order to be able to draw accurate conclusions about where your real issues are, how your processes look, what your selection decisions really look like, and whether you have adverse impact.
In addition to the adverse impact, one of the things that you base your programs, policies, and outreach are on your AAP and on the conclusions that you find. So if you're finding adverse impact in an area, you're going to be putting together programs, policies, outreach, whatever the case may be, to try and correct that. So you may be putting time, effort, and energy into the wrong programs, policies, and outreach. So it is both about the finding of discrimination that may be accurate or inaccurate, but it's also about then what are you doing with those conclusions to try and fix them when they may or may not exist.
The other effective missing data, and this is one that everybody can relate to, is the time and expense and the resources that can be lost if you have missing data. And the time and expense and the resource costs are really internal costs and external costs. Internal costs, you're going to have to, go through those boxes of paper. You're going to have to hunt down that information if you have missing data, if you have gaps in your data. So it's going to tie up your internal resources. People are going to be focusing on filling in these data gaps rather than doing the things that they need to do on a day-to-day basis to make your business run. With respect to the external cost, if you're working with a consultant, if you're working with somebody outside of your organization, whether that's an AAP expert or a statistical consultant or an employment lawyer, there's going to be significant time and expense involved in going back to you to ask, why is this data point missing? What's the race for these 5 people? Then to do a data entry project to get that information in there. And it's been my experience that missing data in terms of identifying the gaps, collecting the information, and filling it in really can significantly add to the overall cost of the project. It's not unreasonable to think that missing data can double the cost of an underlying analysis. It takes time and effort to fill in these gaps, and this can delay results, can tie up internal personnel. You can run into time constraints. The OFCCP only gives you a certain amount of time to respond. So it's much easier for everybody, internally, externally. It's easier to keep correct and comprehensive data on an ongoing basis. If you see that you've got a gap somewhere, investigate it. Find out if it's a one-off case or if there's some sort of a systemic problem in your systems. Fill in that gap and really keep this information as comprehensive, as complete, and as accurate as you can on an ongoing basis. It's going to save you time. It's going to save you effort. It's going to save you money.
And that time frame that you have for an OFCCP audit is 30 days, and that's a very quick turnaround, especially if you have a lot of missing data or data issues. So yes, there is a short time frame. It's 30 days for an OFCCP audit. And for those companies who have multiple locations that have the opportunity for audit, if you were to get more than one audit at once, that becomes a very short time frame. And just kind of a little side note here is not just that you have the 30 days to respond to the desk audit portion of this, but you want what you send to the OFCCP audit, that first stage, the desk audit stage, to be 100% correct. You don't want to have to go back and say, oh, this was wrong, oh, this was missing, I meant this. That's when they're going to start questioning the validity of your data, your documentation, and want to come on site. They're going to dig deeper. So you really want to have good data, not just for regular AAP planning, but then also that when you submit it for OFCCP audit. And the better it is for your AAP, the better it's going to be for your audit, and the quicker you're going to be able to respond in that time frame.
And just to make one point about missing data and litigation, it's also true for audit, but it's particularly true for litigation and if you're involved in any kind of litigation. Missing data really can be the make or break point in litigation. If you don't have the information that you need to demonstrate your defense and your business justifications, without that data, you're not going to be able to do it. You're going to be vulnerable. So it's really important, from a risk management perspective, to make sure that you have this data that you can justify and back up all of your business decisions, all of your selection decisions. Keep that underlying data. If you find issues, if you find missing data, it's important to go in and fill that information in as soon as possible. And I always caution people that every change you make to your data, regardless of what kind of data it is, if you're filling in missing race and gender, ethnicity, if you're making corrections to higher title, whatever kind of alteration you're making to that data, it's got to be thoroughly documented. You need to keep a record of when the change was made, why you made the change, what information was replaced, the source documentation, how you figured out that it was an inaccurate data point, etc. I know that sounds a little onerous, but it really can make a big difference in the event of regulatory investigations or litigation. If you've got your data documented, if you've got a clean, correct, comprehensive data set, you're going to be in a far better position to defend your decisions than if you have missing data, inaccurate data, if you have to produce the same data 3 or 4 different times with corrections, and you really need to document everything. I know we always say document, 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 but if you go back and you make a change this year to somebody's hire title, for instance, if you're involved in litigation 3 years down the road, you're not going to remember that you changed the title for this person for this reason. So it's really important to have that documentation.
The same goes for OFCCP audits. Documentation and documentation of any changes that you made are very important because business justification for the decisions that you made are the key to having a successful OFCCP audit. When you don't have the documentation that you need and there's evidence of discrimination, then we all know that that kind of ends in a conciliation agreement. And it's always tough when I'm trying to help a client through an OFCCP audit, and if we just would have had that documentation, we could have explained and given the business justification for the choice. We wouldn't have ended in that conciliation agreement. So whether it's litigation, whether it's audit, documentation and clean data are key. Okay, now we're going to move on to data scrubbing. So we've talked to you about what kind of data you need, what kind of gaps you have, and now we're going to move on to what are the steps once you know what's missing, and even some more steps to help you identify whether you have all the right information. So the first one is do we have the right people? And what I mean by that is, do you know for sure that you have everybody hired during the particular time frames that you're looking at? And I will find a good 20% of the time when clients send me data that there are missing people on the hire log. And so what we want to give you are some of the things that how we find issues and help people correct them. And so the first thing is when I'm looking at the hire log and I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that they have everybody, the first thing I do is take a look at the last year's workforce snapshot. So that point-in-time report that looks at, that has everybody in your company or at that location from last year's AAP, and then I take that exact same report, the workforce snapshot, and compare it. And for those people that were not on last year's and are on this year's, are they on the hire log? So that's just kind of the first point of comparison. Another analysis and comparison that I do for validation purposes is to sort your current workforce snapshot by hire date and make sure that for those people that have the hire date during the time frame that you're looking at, are those people on the hire log? And then the other thing that I do is look at the term log. And so I look at the term log, and just like on the hire log that you should have the termination date, on the term log you should have the hire date. And on the term log, sort it by hire date, and if you've got people that were in the time frame that you're looking at, make sure that those people are on the hire log. So those are 3 really important steps and 3 good ways to see if someone fell through the cracks with regard to hire date. It can happen a couple different ways. It can happen by their hire information being input a little bit too early, a little bit too late. It could just, it could be someone incorrectly put a date before or after, and so the reports are catching it. So there's different ways, there's different reasons why it happens, but those are a few steps that can help you figure out if you do have missing people. The next is, do you have the right codes? And by codes, I mean your EEO1 and your AA job group codes, because these are the basis upon which you're doing your adverse impact. So you're going to be looking at your hires versus your applicants by job title and by job group. So you want to make sure that you have those codes and those titles correct. And my first suggestion is to make sure that your workforce snapshot titles and codes are correct. So on your workforce snapshot, by job title, they should all have the same EEO1 and AA job group code. And then you use that as a basis to analyze your other employment activity, your hires, terms, promos, to make sure that those same job titles have your have the same EEO and AA job group code. And so that's really the key to make sure that you have good and consistent codes by title throughout your different laws.
And tying into what Carla just said about having the right codes, the central question that I always look for is, are we consistent? Whether you're doing your AAP or really any kind of analysis, whether you're doing it in-house or whether you're working with an outside consultant, chances are somewhere along the line the process is going to be automated. Automation makes things faster and easier, but you got to remember that computers are dumb. And let me give you an example of what I mean here. If you have a job title of MGR, that's shorthand for manager, and you have somebody else who has the same job title, but that person's title is coded MANAGER, the computer, the automation process is going to treat those as completely different job titles. We see this frequently not only in job title, but in job codes, descriptions, any kind of variation that you have, whether you're using MGR or spelling out manager, we're going to have to go through, you're going to have to go through and clean that all up. So those are some of the things you want to look for. Do we have variations in our titles, locations, descriptions, etc.? If we do, we need to make sure that all of our entries are consistent. And variations in those things really exponentially increase the time and the cost of the analysis. Ideally, if you're using some sort of an HRIS system, you want to avoid text entries and you want to look for table-driven entries that are going to simplify and standardize the process. The less information you have to type in, the better off you are, because the less chance of variation, the less chance of typographical errors. You really want to aim for consistency, and automation and table-driven processes really simplify, standardize, and help make sure that you have that consistency that you need. And finally, one of the things that I look for is where are the gaps in the data. Looking at the gaps in the data can help you identify any shortcomings that you may have in your processes and procedures in your HRIS system. Things to look for here are, is it a systemic gap? Are we missing gender, race, ethnicity for everybody hired from a particular location? Is it a one-off, kind of a random process? If you can figure out where your gaps are, and you can look at them to see if they're random, if they're one-off, or if there really is something systemic going on, that's going to help prevent future issues in future problems. You can identify where those gaps, where those systemic problems are, and take action now to correct them, which will make everything smoother and easier in the future. So if you're finding gaps, step back for a moment, take a look and see if there's some kind of a pattern to those gaps. And if so, look into your systems, look into your processes and procedures, and make corrections as appropriate. The one final point I want to make about the data scrubbing and data validation is it's really an interactive process. And what I'm going to talk about here is with respect to working with outside consultants. And again, Carla and I have different backgrounds. We focus on different areas of the process. Typically what I do is I exchange lists and subfiles with the client if I find gaps, if I find things that look suspicious or data errors. No data set is ever going to be 100% perfect all the time. But if you try to make those data sets as consistent, as comprehensive, and as clean as possible on an ongoing basis, everybody's lives are easier. My preference when I'm working on these kinds of things is just to get a complete dump of your HR transactions database. I prefer to create the hire log and the activity files myself. Other consultants have different preferences. It depends on the particular person that you're working with. But regardless of what kind of information you're providing, whether it's a summary, activity log, or whether it's the whole HR database, both the client and the consultant have a role in assuring the data set is as clean and comprehensive as possible before undertaking analysis. If you know you've got holes in your data, if you know you've got bad data, it doesn't make sense to go ahead with the analysis because the analysis is going to be meaningless. So the way I see it is part of my job is to identify any data anomalies or potential issues and send those back to you in the form of questions. And part of your job is to investigate those anomalies and questions and provide responses that clarify, that fill in all those missing pieces. And I really think it's an interactive process. The client and the consultant really do have to work together to get the most accurate and comprehensive data set possible before we even start to think about doing any kind of analysis.
The same goes for me from an OFCCP audit perspective and working with AAPs. It really is an interactive process, and all of the things that Stephanie mentioned I do with my clients also. The little difference that I do is how I get my data. I don't get a full data, data dump. It usually comes to me in separate Excel, in one workbook, separate sheets with regard to your workforce snapshot, hires, terms, promos that I get from the client. But again, the interactive process is very important. And so, and then I also try and take the next step of, okay, we've identified where your issues are because I've looked at your data, I found the gaps, I've sent you questions, and then at the end of the AAP process, not only do I go over with the client what where their issues may be with regard to the AAP, outreach things that they can do, but what are some policies, procedures, adjustments to systems that you can do. I do a lot of work with applicant tracking systems, HRIS systems, to kind of help people make it so that those gaps that we're finding, they no longer have. So whether you're working with a consultant or whether you're doing it internally, it's an interactive process with either you are the consultant or you and your internal resources, be it the HRIS department, the recruiting department, whatever it is, to try and find those gaps. And once the AAP process is done, really make a project of how do I fix those gaps and those holes.
I think the bottom line to sort of wrap up this whole discussion that we've had today, and this is going to be true not only for hiring but for other pieces of the Affirmative Action Plan, your AAPs really can drive process improvements. They can drive the policies and procedures and guide the direction of the organization. They can tell you what you need to focus on to better yourself. The catch is, if you have inaccurate data, then you're going to have an inaccurate AAP. And the AAP and the conclusions and the inferences that you draw from your AAP results are only going to be meaningful if they're based on clean and accurate data. If you don't have clean and accurate data, like I said before, it's going to lead to misidentification of potential problem areas. It's going to look like you have a problem somewhere that you really don't, or a problem that you do have may be masked because of inaccurate data. So it's really important to start back at the beginning and focus on getting the best data that you can in terms of cleanliness, accuracy, comprehensiveness, and that's going to help you in not only preparing your AAP, but in the event of an audit, regulatory investigation, or if you find yourself involved in litigation.
And on top of an audit and litigation, in order to be proactive and really create meaningful outreach programs, all of those things are based on your AAP. And so to have meaningful and proactive outreach, you have to have a correct AAP. So the last slide is just our contact information. If you have any questions. I do have a few questions that came through. So the first question is, will we have access to your slides after the webinar? Yes, so for those attendees, we will be sending out a copy of the presentation for you. Is a company, the next question, is a company that has received a Department of Energy grant required to have an AAP if they have over 50 employees? If they have over 50 employees and the contract is for over $50,000, then yes, you are required to create an AAP within 120 days of the grant of that contract. So those are the two questions that I have. The other thing to make mention of, we will be sending the slides to you for those who attended. We are also recording the session so that it could be listened to at a later date for you or for anyone else.
And if anybody has any other questions that you haven't submitted yet, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll do our best to address those.
Wait a little bit, see if anybody else has raised their hand. Okay. If anybody has any other questions, again, this slide has all of our contact information. Feel free to contact either of us. It also has our websites, because both of them have information, newsletters, blogs, podcasts, all of those types of things. There's a lot of information with regard to affirmative action on both of our websites.
Thanks for everybody for participating, and we'll see you in another 2 weeks when we talk about promotions.
Thanks so much.